one step back from actually looking at the sort of detail of these agreements or talking about the agreements themselves and think about some of the important elements I think we need to have in mind as we're thinking about where we've come from, the agreements we're looking at today, and where we're going in the future. But first of all, I can't resist talking briefly about the USMCA, because I think, you know, there may be some criticisms of it, and I could offer a few, but I think we're much better off having that agreement than we would have been if we didn't have the agreement. I mean, we're better off with it than if President Trump had decided he was going to withdraw from the NAFTA and we were then just falling back on the WTO as the agreement between Canada and the United States. But I do think it's rather curious. It's sort of a bit like Alice in Wonderland that we've, you know, the NAFTA was the President Trump touted was the worst agreement that had ever been negotiated, the worst trade agreement ever negotiated. And then rather miraculously, by a few tinkerings with it, and then bringing in some elements of the TPP to help modernize it, I'd remind you the TPP wasn't exactly Donald Trump's favorite agreement either, it suddenly has become the best trade agreement that was ever negotiated. And I think from a broad policy point of view, this puts Canada in a better position. It's a good idea that the President of the United States thinks that the basic trade agreement between our countries is the best agreement that's ever been negotiated, rather than it be the worst agreement, because I think that helps to remove some of the uncertainty that have been created in the business community as a result of his repeated attacks on the NAFTA. Now, to take one step back, and I'd like to look a little bit at the historical evolution of what it is that's covered in a trade agreement. I think it's interesting today that most of the discussion about trade agreements has focused on the goods sector. The one big exception was you, Joe, who talked about your role as a management consultant and lobbying to make sure that those issues were adequately addressed in agreements with the United States. And I think that's very important. And it's interesting to see that we started with trade agreements in goods, but they now cover services, intellectual property, investment, and increasingly other matters. Digital trade, electronic commerce. The world is definitely evolving. And I think when we think about and we analyze trade agreements, we need to be thinking of them in this much broader context from a sort of whole economy perspective. One of the problems, of course, is that a lot of the statistics are really only measuring what goes on in the goods sector. So, and the person to fall prey to this most quickly, of course, is Donald Trump talking about trade deficits, where he's only thinking of goods, and at that, really only manufactured goods. And the economy is so much broader than that. It's a little bit, I'm reminded, if you go back and think of the role of agriculture, I don't have the exact statistics, but if you think of the role of agriculture in the economy in the middle of the 19th century, it was by far the largest source of employment. And now I think the agriculture sector, primary agriculture anyway, accounts for something like 2% of Canadian employment. But the production of Canadian agriculture is much larger. We're watching now a similar thing in the manufacturing sector with the evolving technology, rapidly changing technology. You can now produce a lot more manufactured goods with much less labor. So we're seeing the labor force engaged in manufacturing decline, not because we're no longer an efficient manufacturing country, but because the nature of how goods are produced has changed so dramatically. And so the services industry and other industries are becoming much more important. It's interesting thinking back on some of the things that have been said today too, because, you know, when you look back at when people were talking about Pierre Trudeau worrying about foreign investment, well, that's rather interesting. That was when foreign investment, we saw that sort of taking over our natural resources, rather than thinking about foreign investment as a source of innovation in our economy and in bringing in a new dynamic. So a lot of things have changed very dramatically. Now, I'd like to go back and think briefly about that period in the 1980s early 1980s, before the start of the free trade agreement negotiations with the United States, before the start of the GATT negotiations that led to the formation of the Uruguay round. Now that was a very interesting period because although trade agreements had begun to move out of strictly dealing with goods and looking at some non-tariff barriers issues, the services and intellectual property and investment really lay outside the scope of what was being covered by trade agreements. I went down to, I got invited quite a few times over the last year or so to go down to Washington. I think this had, whereas the preceding few years I wasn't invited much, this had to do with the fact that I've been the Canadian chief negotiator for the NAFTA, and I was asked to go to a number of panels and meetings. And I was on one panel at the Center for Strategic and International Studies on NAFTA that was chaired by Bill Brock. Bill Brock was the American United States trade representative in the early 1980s under President Reagan. And I remembered him from some of the quadrilateral trade ministers meetings I used to go to and so on. Anyway, we both got there early, so we had about 15 minutes to chat. And I started reminding him about the early 1980s. And I said, I thought it has been a very creative period in terms of thinking of what the future agenda should be for trade policy issues. And he started reminiscing about when the first day he arrived at the office of the United States Trade Representative as the new United States Trade Representative. And he asked the staff there, he said, who's the smartest person you've got here? And he said pretty soon he was sitting down across from a guy called Geza Fekete, who I remember was sort of the strategic thinker at USTR in terms of where, and Brock said to me, he said to Geza, tell me what's missing in our trade agreements? And Geza Fekete said, services, intellectual property, and investment. Now this is really quite interesting because when we got into these international meetings in the early 1980s, including the 1982 GATT ministerial meeting, it was really Brock and the Americans who led the charge for trying to look at expanding the traditional GATT agenda to cover these new areas. And what Brock was able to do in this process too was really get the business community very interested in this. Because the business community in the United States was very much interested in seeing this agenda expanded to include services. A lot of the big services companies could see the benefits of this, led perhaps by the financial services industry, but also including others. The intellectual property people saw a real value in trying to associate intellectual property provisions and disciplines with the trading system. And that really began to drive the process. Now there was a lot of resistance to this initially, but this 1982 ministerial meeting led to a lot of work that really created a new dynamic internationally in terms of various organizations looking at what was really needed for this future trade agenda. What were the things that should be addressed? What were the wrong roads? And this work was done in the OECD, the UNCTAD, the World Bank. There was a lot of academic work. There were a lot of ad hoc international conferences. And it was a very creative period. And gradually, slowly, the world began to accept maybe this was an agenda that was what should be pursued. And by the time we got to 1986, we had the launch of what became the Uruguay round of GATT negotiations that led to the WTO and actually brought these new disciplines into the international trading system. Now, to just step sideways for a minute and think about Canada during this period, we had discussion earlier of the MacDonald Royal Commission, which was a very important piece of thinking that clearly contributed and provided an intellectual foundation for what was done in the free trade negotiations. A thorough examination of the Canadian economy, plus looking at what kind of world were we coming into and what lay ahead. And I think to a very large extent, the intellectual capital that was built up in Canada and internationally through this process I've just described is really the same intellectual capital to a large extent that we're drawing on even in the negotiations we've just completed negotiating. And yet the world has changed fundamentally, but we've not really gone back and done a fundamental new look at how do we respond to these challenges that are coming ahead of us. And I would argue that we can't go back and redo what we've done in the last 20 years. I think this is one of the reasons, by the way, why the WTO negotiations, the Doha round, floundered, is because they really hadn't been adequately prepared for it. We hadn't done the kind of thinking that we did that allowed the Uruguay round, the free trade negotiations, the NAFTA to be successful. And but going forward, we perhaps have even bigger challenges, and I would suggest we need to really sit down and begin by saying, what are the key questions that we need to be asking ourselves and that need to be answered? To give you an example, how do we try to grapple with this whole question of the competitive race over who's going to dominate on artificial intelligence in the 21st century? Here you've got a competition, or it's more than a competition, it's a confrontation really over artificial intelligence between the United States and China. And I think that a lot of effort and thinking needs to go into trying to come up with some creative ideas for how this process of that competitive dynamic could be better managed. And I think there's a role in this for Canada. You know, I think the trade ministers meeting that Minister Carr hosted 2 weeks ago in Ottawa with a number of like-minded countries, these are the sort of countries that can actually help contribute to a better understanding and new ideas and some new thinking on these matters that it might be hard for the United States and China to come out with on their own. Not that they couldn't think of it, but the question is one of them going to look sort of more accommodating to the other before they start, or would it be kind of helpful if some other people began to say, maybe here's how we should be thinking about proceeding, and then provided a platform on which these other two could then come in and weigh in terms of how they would like to see the system designed. Now let me see, where are my notes here? I'd like to say a couple of other things. I look forward to the question and answer session, so I don't want to take too long. Let me say a few words about the United States and the world, because I think it's ironic to see what's going on at the present time. I mean, you've got who would have thought, you know, a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago even, that the United States would be the country that would sort of turn on the multilateral trading system, the international trade rules, of which the United States was the principal architect. I mean, they're sort of turning on their own system. Mind you, maybe they're doing a bit of that domestically as well, so perhaps we shouldn't be so surprised. But it's interesting that this is going on now too, because if you go back to, say, about 1970, the United States was a much more powerful country in terms of its dominant role in the world. It was much more powerful in terms of its role in the trading system. It was by far the world's largest trading country, and yet trade accounted for a much smaller proportion of American GDP than it does today, by a factor of about 3 or 4. So at the same time the United States is less powerful in the world, they're more vulnerable to and more dependent on the outside world, and yet they seem to be looking at how to walk away from it. That doesn't make a lot of sense. And you can go into this in a lot more detail, but it's interesting to go back and dig out these statistics and look at these figures, because they're quite striking. And I think something has gone on that I think is beneficial in the United States in the last couple of years since President Trump arrived on the scene, and that is he has really forced Americans in the business community, in political circles, to take stock of what is their stake in trade? How important is trade? I mean, there've been, for years now, NAFTA's been the whipping boy of the U.S. political classes, but it's really only recently that they got a president who said, I really plan to tear this up. And they said, I think he's serious. You know, he might really do this. So they've had to think through what would that mean if that happened. And the same thing in terms of some of these crazy trade actions he's taking. So this is involving not just Canada and Mexico with the United States, but the rest of the world. And I think that Americans, by and large, have decided actually trade is good for them. It's important. And this is perhaps also why it's tempered Donald Trump a bit, and he's agreed to a renegotiation, and we've now got the best agreement that was ever negotiated, rather than tearing it up and getting rid of it, which I think might have actually been his preference. Now, I did say I was going to talk about trade-offs. So let me conclude on that point, because I can remember in my experience as a negotiator, I was often asked about trade-offs and, you know, what did you have to give up and so on. And I was struck by something in the discussion this morning. There was some discussion of trade-offs, but actually, and I think quite appropriately, the point was made that most of these trade-offs are in the domestic environment rather than with our trading partners. We have to really, because a trade negotiation is an opportunity to think through what is it we really want to do domestically? Are there reforms we'd like to promote through a trade negotiation? And partly blame on what the foreigners asked us to do. My experience too in a trade negotiation is if you start by thinking about trade-offs, what are you going to have to give up? That's a very difficult discussion to have and a very difficult plan for trying to convince politicians that they should go through with the deal. It's a lot better to think about how do you build this agreement up to make sure that there's something in it for everybody? How does everybody get some benefit rather than how do we share the pain? And I think it's a much better plan for thinking about trade negotiations. So I'm very leery of the notion of talking about trade-offs and trade negotiations, because I think it's a recipe for not really going anywhere. So thank you very much.